Ethan had always thought of Daniel as more than just a friend, though he had never admitted it to anyone, not even himself at first. They had grown up practically as brothers, sharing summer afternoons climbing trees, stealing ice cream from the corner store, and running through fields until the sun dipped below the horizon. Daniel was loud, fearless, and somehow effortlessly charming, while Ethan had always been quieter, more thoughtful, watching the world and the people around him with careful attention. It had been easy to blend into the background beside Daniel, to let him shine, while Ethan kept his own feelings tucked away like a secret treasure, a small flame burning quietly in the corners of his heart. Now, years later, that quiet flame felt hotter than ever. Daniel had changed in subtle ways. He had a girlfriend now, someone new, someone who made Daniel laugh in ways Ethan hadn't heard in a long time. Ethan should have been happy for him, he told himself repeatedly, but the knot in his chest only tightened when he thought about it. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, not the kind that made a person spiteful or angry, but something heavier, more complicated, something that made his stomach turn and his throat feel tight whenever Daniel smiled at her. It was a longing he didn't quite understand, a pull towards someone who had never even considered him in that way. And then there was Mark, Daniel's father. Ethan had always found him intriguing, though he had never quite understood why. Mark was a quiet man, strong but not overbearing, someone who observed the world and its people with a patience that could almost feel like a weight. His presence was calm, yet there was something about the way he looked at Ethan, something that made Ethan feel noticed in a way he rarely did. It wasn't about anything Daniel had taught him to expect. It was something deeper, almost instinctive, a connection that seemed to simmer quietly beneath the surface of everyday conversation. It happened on a warm Saturday morning, when Mark suggested that Ethan help him check the old fence line along the edge of their property. "It's been a while since anyone walked out there," Mark said casually, brushing a speck of dust from his sleeve. "Might be good for you to get some fresh air." Ethan hesitated, sensing something unspoken in the offer. There was no way to know exactly why Mark had chosen him, but something in the way he spoke made it hard to refuse. With a reluctant nod, Ethan agreed, telling himself it was just helping a neighbor, a simple errand, nothing more. The path into the woods was narrow and uneven, the kind of trail that disappeared behind tall trees and wild grasses. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across the dirt beneath their feet. Ethan walked beside Mark, feeling the quiet tension in the air, noticing the way his hand brushed the rough bark of a tree without thinking. There was a stillness to the forest, a sense that the world had narrowed down to just the two of them, and with each step, Ethan felt the quiet weight of something unsaid pressing against his chest. Mark spoke occasionally, his voice low and steady, pointing out where a fence post had rotted or where the ground had shifted. His words were simple, matter-of-fact, yet there was an undercurrent of attention in the way he spoke to Ethan, as if he were trying to understand him without ever asking directly. Ethan found himself talking more than he expected, mentioning small details about his own life, the little frustrations and triumphs he usually kept to himself. There was no judgment, no probing, only a patient listening that made Ethan feel seen in a way he hadn't realized he had been craving. At one point, they stopped by a clearing where sunlight broke through canopy, illuminating the green of the grass and the scattered wildflowers. Mark leaned against a tree, arms crossed, watching Ethan as he examined a fence post. "You've seemed different lately," he said finally, almost casually, but Ethan could feel the weight of the words. He froze, unsure how much to reveal, how much to say without betraying feelings he barely understood himself. "Different?" he repeated, voice catching slightly. "Yes," Mark said softly, not pressing, only observing. "Like you're carrying something heavy, something you're not telling anyone." Ethan swallowed, feeling the knot in his chest tighten. How could he explain this to Mark? How could he explain that the weight he carried was a combination of longing, guilt, and a confusion he couldn't untangle? He said nothing at first, only stared at the grass at his feet, feeling the warmth of the sun on his shoulders and the quiet presence of Mark nearby. The silence between them was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was charged, electric in its own subtle way. Ethan's mind raced, replaying moments from the past weeks, moments with Daniel, with his own thoughts, and now this quiet walk with Mark. Every glance, every pause, seemed significant, as if the world itself had slowed down to draw attention to the unspoken connection between them. He realized with a jolt that he had never felt this kind of attention before, this deep, quiet acknowledgement of his existence, his feelings, his heart. It was frightening and exhilarating at the same time. They continued walking, the forest closing around them, the sound of the world outside fading. Ethan noticed how Mark's presence seemed to anchor him, how the simple act of walking side by side could stir feelings he had tried so hard to suppress. He couldn't pinpoint when the line between admiration, gratitude, and something more complicated began to blur, only that it had, and it left him feeling both guilty and alive in ways he hadn't expected. By the time they reached the end of the trail, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and reluctance. Relief that the walk was over, yet reluctance that it had ended at all. Mark gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of the walk, of the moments shared, of something neither had said out loud, but both seemed to understand. Ethan left the woods that day with his heart heavier than when he had entered, a quiet storm of emotion swirling inside him, a secret he wasn't ready to name but couldn't ignore. As he walked home, Ethan realized that things had shifted. The simplicity of childhood friendship had faded, replaced by something complex, something forbidden in its emotional intensity. He couldn't tell Daniel, not yet, and he certainly couldn't tell anyone else. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that this walk, this moment, had changed everything, though he had no idea just how far-reaching those changes would be. Ethan couldn't shake the memory of that morning in the woods. Every detail haunted him. The sunlight through the leaves, the soft tone of Mark's voice, the quiet way he had observed him. Even days later, Ethan found himself replaying their walk in his mind, analyzing every glance and pause as though the forest itself had whispered secrets meant only for him. The memory stirred something deep inside, a combination of warmth, longing, and guilt that he couldn't quite name. Trying to return to normal life around Daniel felt impossible. Daniel's laughter, his easy conversations about plans and dreams, and the excitement he carried when talking about his girlfriend, all of it made Ethan feel painfully aware of his own hidden emotions. He wanted to be happy for him. He genuinely did, but the quiet ache in his chest told him otherwise. It wasn't jealousy in the conventional sense, nor was it resentment. It was more subtle, a longing for attention, for understanding, for someone to see him as deeply as Mark had in that one walk. The days passed, and Ethan noticed the changes in himself. He sought excuses to spend time with Mark, volunteering for small chores he didn't need to do, fixing a loose hinge, carrying firewood, checking the old fence. Each task was mundane, yet in Mark's presence they felt meaningful. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet energy that neither had named but both sensed. Ethan knew he should feel guilty for enjoying these moments, yet he couldn't help the flutter of emotion they stirred in him. Mark, in turn, seemed to notice these subtle shifts. There was a patience in the way he spoke to Ethan, a calmness in his voice that made Ethan feel safe despite the storm of feelings inside him. Sometimes a small smile or a fleeting look carried more weight than words ever could. It was not physical, nor was it inappropriate in any overt sense, but it carried a power Ethan had never experienced before. Each encounter left him thinking, wondering if Mark, too, felt the pull of something unspoken between them. Meanwhile, Daniel remained blissfully unaware. He trusted both his father and Ethan completely, never suspecting that any emotional tension had begun to form. Ethan's guilt deepened with each interaction, knowing that Daniel's innocence and trust made the bond he felt with Mark feel even more complicated. At school, during their usual hangouts, and even in casual conversations, Daniel's happiness was a sharp contrast to the silent storm Ethan carried within himself. One afternoon, as Ethan was stacking firewood near the old barn, Mark appeared without announcement, leaning casually against the doorway. "Mind if I help?" he asked, his tone gentle. Ethan's heart leapt and he nodded, feeling both excitement and unease. Together, they moved logs and secured stacks, working in companionable silence. The physical act of working side by side wasn't significant on its own, but the quiet presence of Mark next to him was a comfort Ethan couldn't resist. It was a subtle intimacy, one that didn't require words or touches, only understanding and acknowledgement. Ethan began to recognize a truth he had avoided. Emotional infidelity did not need to be physical to carry weight. His heart had betrayed itself, forming a bond that neither words nor actions could erase. The quiet glances, the patient listening, the subtle gestures of care, all of it had created a connection too strong to ignore. And yet, he felt conflicted. He loved Daniel in his own way, valued their friendship, and respected his father. This bond with Mark was exhilarating and terrifying, because it existed in a gray space where nothing could be clearly defined. That evening, Daniel visited to discuss weekend plans, his energy and cheerfulness making Ethan's chest ache. "Hey, Ethan, want to help me with some errands?" he asked, grinning. Ethan smiled in return, hiding the tumult of feelings within him. He couldn't tell Daniel what he was feeling. Not about the emotional tension with Mark, not about the quiet storm that had overtaken his heart. And yet, listening to Daniel speak, seeing his innocence and trust, made Ethan acutely aware of the betrayal heart he carried silently. In the quiet moments that followed, Ethan often found himself retreating into memory, replaying the walks and chores, remembering the soft moment of connection he shared with Mark. It wasn't just the words. It was the way Mark's presence could calm him, focus him, and make him feel visible. These encounters became a secret he couldn't share, a private world that existed alongside his daily life, but never intersected openly. The forest, the barn, the simple tasks, they all became symbols of this emotional bond. Ethan realized that he had allowed himself to care deeply, to hope quietly, and to long for something forbidden. He understood that this was not a conventional romance or betrayal, but a subtle, powerful form of infidelity that resided in the heart and mind. It was thrilling and frightening in equal measure, and he was acutely aware of the moral boundaries he had crossed emotionally, even with the weight of guilt pressing on him. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about Mark. Each small encounter was magnified in his mind, and he found himself analyzing every nuance of his attention, every fleeting moment of understanding or recognition. The emotional bond, though unspoken, had begun to reshape the way he saw himself, his loyalty, and his understanding of love. It was a complicated, delicate, and dangerous connection that demanded careful navigation. By the end of the week, Ethan recognized that the emotional territory he had entered could not be ignored. He had crossed into a realm of unspoken intimacy that could alter relationships, trust, and hearts. And yet, he found himself drawn further, unable to turn away from the connection that had awakened something long dormant inside him. The bond with Mark, though invisible to the world, had become a defining element of his life, teaching him that some betrayals are silent, subtle, and infinitely more complex than anyone could see. The following week, Ethan found himself walking toward the woods again, though he told himself it was simply for clarity, for peace of mind. The familiar path stretched before him, dappled with sunlight that filtered through the leaves. The air smelled of earth and rain, carrying the quiet calm he had come to rely on. Each step felt heavier than usual, burdened by the thoughts and emotions swirling relentlessly in his chest. He tried to convince himself that this was a neutral walk, a way to clear his mind, but deep down he knew he was seeking something, or someone. Mark was already there when Ethan arrived, leaning against the bark of an old oak as if he had been waiting. Seeing him, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The energy between them was different now. Not casual, not simple. There was a weight in the silence, an unspoken understanding that both of them had crossed boundaries in their hearts, even if nothing had been acted upon physically. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling both excitement and unease as he stepped closer. "I didn't expect to see you," Mark said softly. His voice had that calm, measured quality that always seemed to ground Ethan, even as it stirred up everything he was trying to contain. "I needed some air," Ethan replied, almost whispering. There was a pause, a silence that stretched longer than either of them wanted to acknowledge. And in that quiet, Ethan felt the intensity of the emotional connection between them more acutely than ever before. They walked side by side through the undergrowth, moving carefully along the narrow trail. The forest was alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, a distant bird call, but it was almost secondary to the awareness each had of the other. Ethan noticed small details he had never paid attention to before. The way Mark's hands brushed lightly against the tree trunks, the subtle tilt of his head when he was listening, the quiet patience in his gaze. Each observation pulled Ethan closer into a world he knew he could not share, a private intimacy that existed solely between them. Eventually, they reached the clearing where they had sat before. The sunlight was softer now, filtered to the high branches, casting long, dancing shadows across the ground. They sat together on the old fallen log. The damp would cool beneath them. Neither spoke immediately. Ethan's mind raced with everything he wanted to say but knew he could not. Everything he felt but could not name. Mark finally broke the silence, voice gentle but tinged with vulnerability. "Sometimes I feel alone," he admitted quietly. "Even with Daniel around, even at home." The words struck Ethan deeply, stirring an ache he had tried to suppress. He understood the loneliness, having felt it himself in different ways, yet hearing it voiced aloud intensified the connection between them. For a moment, neither spoke again, the weight of emotion filling the space around them. Ethan felt the magnetic pull of Mark's attention, a silent acknowledgement that left his chest tight and heart racing. They sat like that for a while, sharing the quiet in a way that transcended words. Ethan realized that the infidelity he feared was not physical. It existed in the heart and mind, in the longing and attention that neither dared voice openly. The line between mentorship, trust, and something more had blurred, creating a space where boundaries were tested, emotions raw, and consequences inevitable. Each second of silence carried its own weight, a reminder that emotional betrayal could be as potent and consuming as any physical act. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Ethan felt a sense of foreboding. The unspoken understanding between them had shifted something fundamental in his world, something that could not be undone. Mark offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and Ethan returned it, feeling a surge of emotion he could not name. They walked back along the trail, side by side, both aware of the uncharted territory they were navigating. Later that evening, Daniel arrived unexpectedly, full of energy and unaware of the quiet tension simmering between his father and Ethan. "Hey, Ethan, want to help me with some errands before dinner?" he asked, his grin bright and carefree. Ethan forced a smile, hiding the emotional storm within. Daniel's innocence and trust made the weight of the secret all the more crushing. Ethan realized that the emotional bond he had formed with Mark, while unspoken and invisible, had consequences. He could no longer move through life without the awareness of what had shifted in his heart. In the days that followed, Ethan's thoughts became increasingly consumed by the bond with Mark. He replayed moments from the woods, analyzing every glance, every gesture, every subtle expression. Each interaction carried emotional weight far beyond its outward simplicity. Ethan felt both exhilarated and trapped, caught between loyalty to Daniel, the safety of unspoken boundaries, and the compelling intensity of connection that seemed to define him in ways he could not ignore. One afternoon, Ethan returned to the clearing alone, needing space to process his feelings. The forest was quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the ground. He sat on the fallen log, running his fingers over the rough bark, remembering Mark's calm presence, the subtle vulnerability in his voice, and the shared silence that had revealed more than words ever could. Ethan realized how deeply he had allowed himself to care, how entwined his emotions had become with someone he could not openly claim. It was in that solitude that he understood the gravity of the situation. Emotional infidelity was not simply about acts. It was about attention, longing, and invisible threads that could bind hearts in ways that were thrilling, terrifying, and irreversible. Ethan's conscience ached, but he also recognized that he could not undo the bond he had formed. It existed now, quietly but powerfully, shaping his understanding of loyalty, love, and consequence. As the week drew to a close, Ethan knew the emotional terrain he had entered could not remain untouched. The forest, the quiet walks, the small gestures, all had created a delicate, invisible web connecting him to Mark in ways that would affect everyone involved. The story of hearts, trust, and longing had reached a pivotal moment, and Ethan understood that the coming days would test his morals, his loyalty, and the very limits of what he could bear without breaking. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the forest, about Mark, about the unspoken connection that had grown between them. The weight of it pressed on him, a constant reminder that some bonds could not be ignored, no matter how much he tried to bury them. He had learned the complexity of emotional infidelity, the kind that exists in the heart and mind, where longing, attention, and understanding could shift lives without a single word spoken. And now, the consequences were unavoidable. It began when Daniel approached him one evening, his expression unreadable. Ethan froze, feeling the familiar pang of guilt twist in his chest. "Ethan, we need to talk," Daniel said quietly, almost cautiously. The warmth in his usual voice was gone, replaced by a careful restraint that made Ethan's stomach churn. They sat on the porch, the sun setting in a haze of gold and pink, and Daniel's eyes searched Ethan's face as if trying to find the truth in the lines of his expression. I don't know exactly what to say," Daniel admitted, "but I feel like something's changed. With you and my dad." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to explain, to reassure, but the words lodged in his throat. How could he explain a heart's longing without betraying trust? How could he confess emotions without shattering a friendship? The moral weight of the situation pressed down, heavier than any single misstep could. Mark, too, seemed to sense the tension, though from a distance. Ethan noticed him lingering near the edge of the yard, his presence calm yet full of awareness. He understood, as Ethan did, that boundaries had been tested in ways that could not be undone. Words alone could not repair the delicate web of emotions that had formed. It was not physical betrayal, but it was profound nonetheless, and the awareness of it carried its own consequences. Ethan finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "Daniel, I don't think anything physical happened, but emotionally, something shifted. I didn't mean for it. I couldn't control it." Daniel's gaze softened slightly, though a shadow of hurt remained. He nodded, struggling to reconcile his trust with the awareness that hearts could wander even without action. "I get it," he said slowly, "but it still hurts, even knowing that." The following days were quiet. Ethan withdrew, giving Daniel space while simultaneously reflecting on his own actions and feelings. He spent time alone in the forest, retracing steps along the familiar path, sitting on the fallen log, and thinking about the lessons the woods had taught him. Emotional bonds could be intoxicating, powerful, and transformative, but they carried responsibility. Ethan realized that the connection he felt with Mark, while meaningful, could not exist without cost, and that understanding gave him a painful clarity. Mark approached him one afternoon, standing a few paces away in the clearing. There was no need for words. The forest itself seemed to provide the space for understanding. Ethan felt the quiet weight of Mark's presence, the same calm energy that had drawn him in from the beginning. Mark gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, acknowledging the emotional storm they had both navigated. "We have to be careful," he said quietly, "for their sake and ours." Ethan nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Boundaries would need to be respected, and emotional restraint would have to replace the unspoken longing that had carried them this far. Over time, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Ethan focused more on his friendships, his studies, and the ordinary tasks of daily life. He still thought of Mark occasionally, still remembered the walks, the conversations, and the subtle moments of connection, but now those memories existed in a different light. They were lessons, reminders of the power of attention, understanding, and emotional intimacy, rather than guides for action. The forest had taught him that some bonds are meant to be felt, survived, and honored in silence rather than acted upon. Daniel, too, began to heal. The conversation on the porch had opened a door for honesty, for acknowledgement of the emotional complexities that had arisen. Trust had been strained, but not broken entirely. Over time, he found himself smiling again, laughing, and sharing moments with Ethan that reminded them both why their friendship had been so strong to begin with. The shared understanding of boundaries, consequences, and the fragility of trust became the foundation for rebuilding the connection they had almost lost. Ethan often returned to the woods alone, finding solace in the quiet and the shadows of the trees. He would sit on the fallen log, letting the wind stir the leaves and reflect on the lessons of his heart. Emotional infidelity, he realized, was not about breaking rules. It was about awareness, restraint, and understanding the weight of attention and longing. It was a lesson in humanity, in the complexity of relationships, and in the quiet power of feelings that could shape lives without being acted upon. Years later, Ethan walked the forest path one last time. The trees were taller now, the sunlight softer, and the air carried the scent of earth and rain, just as it had on that first morning. He paused at the clearing, looking at the log where so much had changed, and felt a mixture of nostalgia, sadness, and peace. The bond he had formed with Mark had been powerful, but it had also been fleeting, a lesson in restraint, love, and consequence. Some connections, he realized, are not meant to be possessed. They are meant to be experienced, understood, and respected from a distance. In that quiet moment, Ethan understood the final truth of his journey. Hearts are capable of longing beyond reason, of feeling connections that defy rules and expectations. But the measure of character is not in the desires themselves. It is in the choices made, the boundaries respected, and the trust preserved even when temptation whispers insistently. And with that understanding, he turned away from the clearing, leaving behind the forest of memory, carrying forward only the lessons, the reflections, and the wisdom a heart forever changed.